Greetings. My name is Mike Bankhead. I am your host. I am a bass player and songwriter from Dayton, Ohio. On today's episode, we go to the greater Atlanta area. That's right, all the way down south of Georgia. And this conversation is with Franklin J. Rabon, a man of many interests. We're going to talk about college football. We're going to talk about baseball. We're going to talk about music. It's an interesting conversation today on the You Could Be My Aramis podcast. I met Franklin primarily because in the past he used to write about baseball. You'll hear that story shortly. Let's get to the conversation, shall we? Hello there, Franklin.
Hello.
Let's start by having you tell the kind people who are listening where you might be from.
I am in Peachtree City, Georgia, which is a kind of distant suburb of Atlanta. And I lived in Atlanta for the last Atlanta area, and specifically Atlanta for most of it, but for the last, 12 years now. And I'm originally from Augusta, Georgia. You know, that's the where to everything.
How many green jackets do you own? You're from Augusta. They give those out,
I own 0 green jackets. Although I have been to the Masters many times, but I do own 0 green jackets. And I played the course once.
I'm kind of jealous. How was it?
I mean, it was pretty much exactly what you would expect. The greens aren't as fast as they are in the tournament, but they're still like the fastest greens you would have ever played. But it is nice because the ball rolls more true, so you don't like have those putts where you actually hit the ball decently and then it just jumps sideways because you're at some crappy public course. So everything rolls really true, but then every now and again you just accidentally putt it 80 feet by the hole. So I did not play from the back tees. I played from like the standard tees. I was 18 at the time. It was actually my 18th birthday present. I was 16 over par, which was really just a couple of holes. At the time, I played golf in high school. I was usually, 3 to 4 or 5 over par was like my normal on a normal course. 10, I had like an 8 and a couple other just blow up holes. I think 15, I had like another 8 or something like that. No, 15, I probably had like a 10 or something like that. So, but yeah, I mean, I did make a couple of birdies. I made a par on 12, the famous hole. So that was, and that one, like all the tees are pretty much right in the same there. So I'm like, yeah, I made a par on that hole. And you see all these, famous players make quadruple bogeys or whatever, but it could have also just easily went sideways in a hurry there. But anyway, that was my story of playing at Augusta. So
that's awesome. My dad was an avid golfer, and I wish he was alive so that he could hear that, because it's one of those places he would have probably committed armed robbery to play. Do you remember Do you remember how we met? I mean, I remember, but I want to. These kind of stories are always entertaining to hear from 2 different angles.
All right, so I mean, I know it had to do with the Capitol Avenue Club blog.
Indeed.
And I'm believing we interacted on Twitter. I know we met up one time, but I believe that was much after we just were conversing through Twitter. I don't remember the specific Twitter interaction, though. That was genesis.
Nobody remembers Twitter interactions because, and actually, that's probably good. If you remember a Twitter interaction, something terrible has probably happened. But yeah, you used to be a writer for Capitol Avenue Club, which is no longer a thing. So let me explain to the listeners what that is. That was a blog centered around my favorite professional baseball team and Franklin's favorite professional baseball team, the Atlanta National League Baseball Club. I believe Capitol Avenue must have been where their headquarters was or something, perhaps.
The old stadium's address was at Capitol Avenue. Yeah.
Okay. And I never got a chance to visit the old stadium because I'm an Ohioan. And by the time I started traveling to baseball games, it was no longer with us. But I did go to games at uh, Turner Park when it was a thing. So this particular baseball blog was, shall we say, sabermetrically friendly. In other words, lean toward objective.
I think Capital
analysis.
Avenue was like very I would say it was a saber blog, so to speak. Some of the stuff we did after, I would say, was more saber friendly than. But I'd say, especially in the beginning, Capital Avenue was almost exclusively. And for those who don't know, sabermetrics is like very in-depth statistical analysis of baseball and like, the stereotypical, I guess Moneyball would be the kind of thing that most people would identify with that. Although it's not exactly the same thing, but, since they made that movie with Brad Pitt, I guess that's probably the most culturally relevant touchstone. But it's how most teams run these days, is using those tools, although way more advanced than anything we had any access to.
So. Yeah, I mean, the teams aren't going to share their proprietary processes, right?
Right.
Broadly,
and we don't have, like, even if we wanted to recreate it, they're spending millions and millions of dollars to do it versus, us, it's like 5 guys and 1 girl in their spare time, like running stuff in spreadsheets, and they've got like full-time staffs of people who work 80 hours a week. So
if you watch baseball and you hear people on broadcast talking about analytics, and usually they do so negatively, which is a crying shame, that's essentially what this is. It's analysis of baseball using objective things that you can prove. Baseball has been around long enough, and there's only so many things that can happen. I don't want to get too deep into base out scenarios because I'm going to lose people, but essentially it's objective analysis of the things that can happen in a baseball game and what helps you win versus what doesn't. But the people who wrote the site were also fans of the Atlanta National League Baseball Club. So I enjoyed visiting it. I enjoyed reading it. Franklin would generally write very intelligent things, and I happen to like smart people, which is why I opened the dialogue with him on Twitter. And then I flew to Atlanta for a concert and thought, you know what, I could meet Franklin face to face. And we hung out and had some drinks and then had some more drinks. It was a good time.
Good times.
So
I do remember that and remember the exact bar and everything. So.
Yeah, I remember there was a newscaster award ceremony in town, and a bunch of news broadcasters were there also getting hammered. And I remember talking to a guy that was a news broadcaster. It looked just like you would expect a news broadcaster to look, like perfectly manicured and coiffed, and it was an interesting experience. So I like to start with baseball because, dear Lord, the Atlanta National League Baseball Club are the champions.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's insane. Like, I'll go like periods of time just forgetting that it happened. I mean, especially with the lockout going right now, I think it makes it easier to forget. And then I'll be like, oh yeah, they won this year. And then of course I personally got a ton of reminders left because like everybody here's like, can you believe the Braves and you won the World Series and UGA won the college football national championship in the same season, which is nutty.
Yeah.
Like that, which, anybody who's from this area can tell you that those are the, teams that people by far kind of care the most about. The Falcons kind of comes and goes in people's minds, I think, but the Braves are pretty steady. And then UGA is like a religion here, unless you happen to subscribe to another college football religion because you went there or something. But
yeah,
in my neighborhood, there's probably 10 different UGA flags. And I mean, my neighborhood's only like 30 houses. And probably 10 of them have and not just like little flags on their door, like gigantic, like 6 foot by 3 foot or 4 foot or whatever flags flying.
Have these people been barking recently?
No, this is a little bit higher class area than that.
Okay.
So they probably only do it when they get trashed. Yeah, and I do like one thing. Like my wife is a UGA grad, and UGA grads are very different than like some of the UGA fans you see, and I think that's true for almost every college. The most sort of rabid fans a lot of times aren't UGA grads. They're more just they're the quote unquote local team. So
yeah.
It just is a kind of a different, like I went to South Carolina for college, and I don't like most of our fans. They just kind of annoy me. So kind of is what it is with college football, I guess.
Yeah. And anyone up here that's been anywhere near Columbus on a football Saturday can understand what the football ass religion things means.
Right. Yeah. You kind of have like, you guys up there, it's like it's a little more spread out in the sense of like, I mean, I guess this year, obviously you had Cincinnati.
The only people that like them live in Cincinnati. Trust me.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's also funny because, most Cincinnati fans are also Ohio State fans in my experience. And it may have recently changed.
There's a subset.
But it would be like
hates to hear people say that, though. There's a subset of Cincinnati fans that has a big chip on their shoulder as regards to the Ohio State University.
Right. Yeah. So, yeah, it's kind of a weird little sub dynamic. Like, it's kind of like on a different level, but it's kind of like here you have Georgia Southern, and people will go there and they'll be Georgia Southern fans, but they're also UGA fans. Because it's just like on a totally different level.
Yeah, they're not going to play probably ever.
Right. So. And Ohio State kind of acts like in some sense that's what Cincinnati is, but then they made it to the playoff this year.
Yeah, it's I kind of like to see it because I like all the Ohio
not the same old teams.
Not the same old teams. And the coach there at Cincinnati is an Ohio State alum, and he is pretty well beloved among Ohio State fan circles. So I don't think, in at least Ohio State fandom, there's not any animosity towards Cincinnati. I think Cincinnati wishes that the Buckeyes would come play them in their own stadium, and there is no universe. There's no universe where that's happening because they don't have enough seats. So,
well, it's not even just. It's also just Ohio State really doesn't have anything to gain by it.
No, nothing at all to gain by it. If they had a 100,000 seat stadium, then maybe. I think the last time the Buckeyes played a quote road game there, it was in the NFL stadium in town, Paul Brown, which seats like 70,000 or whatever. But you're right. Like,
well, even then, I think it's like, if Ohio State wins, it's like, oh, big whoop, who cares? And if they lose, it's like this huge negative mark.
Never hear the end of it.
Right, putting aside the stadium requirements, it's you're in a lose-lose situation in that scenario.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about baseball. We talked about college football, but we both love college football. I used to like reading your college football tweets. I grew up here in the Midwest, and when I was a kid, there wasn't quite as much sports coverage, right? So college football is, of course, a regional sport, but it was even more regional before we had the kind of national TV coverage. So I was probably in my early 20s before I realized that, for instance, the Auburn-Alabama game is important to some people. And the South Carolina-Clemson game is important to some people. Because if you're a college football fan and you grow up in the Midwest, there is one rivalry, and it's the game. And there are other smaller rivalries like Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Indiana, Purdue. And the Rose Bowl is the most important thing on earth. And
then you have the Notre Dame people.
Nobody likes the Notre Dame people. I mean, I don't know about the South, but nobody in Big Ten country likes the Notre Dame people.
Right.
And then, you get older and more games are on TV and you're like, wow, there's a whole lot. What do you mean other people don't think the Rose Bowl is important? But I like it. I think the more football, the better. And I kind of enjoy getting a glimpse into the way different pockets of the country celebrate their local fandom, because we're all pretty different, but it's one of the things that kind of ties us all together. I like it.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting because, the Southeast has always been a really big thing, but it's also always been a really big thing, like you're saying, in the Midwest. The Northeast to a little bit of an extent, but not as much. I mean, they do have, Penn State, obviously, and a few other teams here, but it's not as big as, say, in the Midwest. But And then out west, it's always been big, but they were, like you were saying, they're kind of always separated. The thing that kind of changed all of that was, the SEC expanding and then getting that championship game, which then brought in so much additional money. And then that's when it kind of like started to dawn on people, like, we can make a crazy amount of money televising this. And then everything sort of changed from there. And I think the SEC was always successful in the Southern Conference before it, but really kind of that moment was where, from there is where we are now. As soon as the SEC got a couple more teams to where they were allowed to have an extra championship game, kind of set off that domino effect of the mega conferences, championship games, and then now to this day playoff. So it's definitely been interesting to watch, because South Carolina was one of the two teams where I went that came into the SEC. And
from the ACC, right?
Yeah, well, they were independent for a minute, and then we kind of realized being independent wasn't going to work because we didn't have Notre Dame's draw. But yeah, we were a founding member of the ACC. We were in the Southern Conference before, like, when the SEC existed. Then we went to the ACC. Then we were independent. There was a stint of the Metro Conference as well with Florida State. But we were independent and then came into the SEC with Arkansas.
92.
Yeah. And then that was then they were allowed to have a championship game after that. So it's kind of, and I was 10 then. So I was kind of like really starting to understand what sports meant in some sense, other than just people playing on the screen. So it's been really interesting to watch that all play out.
I sometimes still think that Arkansas is a weird fit for that. I mean, I think South Carolina is a great fit for the SEC, but I'm like, again, I'm dating myself. I'm old enough to remember the Southwest Conference and the Big Eight. So
right. Yeah, well, it's kind of been weird because Arkansas, the state has changed, become much more Southern since that point. I think these days Arkansas as a state, and maybe the football has something to do with it because it's just, believe it or not, that important. But also I think it's just a general sort of cultural shift in the lower Midwest has started to kind of like identify more as Southeast than Midwest. There used to be a time when Arkansas was considered, a purple state, if we're talking politics. And now it's like redder than a lot of Southeastern states. It's been kind of interesting to watch that change as well. Like, Arkansas people don't, even though they're much closer to Texas than Georgia, it's kind of like they culturally almost identify with the Southeast more now, in my experience, at least.
But they're also probably Braves fans.
Yeah. And that's kind of the weird thing about being a Braves fan is like, you get all these pockets of places that just don't have teams. Like if you're in Arkansas, it's not like they showed Astros games.
No.
But, during the heyday of TBS, you'd see Braves games. So if you lived in an area that didn't have a state team, so to speak, a lot of times they would become Braves fans. So yeah, Arkansas, heavy Braves fan. And maybe again, that might have some aspect to do with the entire state sort of culturally seeming a bit more Southern than Midwestern. And I think some of it's like hunting as well, is bigger in Arkansas than it is in, say, it's big in Michigan and Ohio, don't get me wrong, but I think it's probably bigger in Arkansas than it. So it's kind of like a lot of little seemingly insignificant, unrelated things kind of all come together. And the Braves being one, you have all these people who for years are rooting for an Atlanta team. And I think that kind of seeps into every aspect.
How often have you gotten a chance to go catch the Braves on the road?
Not a whole lot. It's just, I've never actually planned a trip to do that. So when I've gone to other stadiums, the Braves just didn't happen to be in town. Like usually my process would be something like, okay, we're going to go to San Francisco. This is when the time works for us. this is the team that just happens to be in town that day. And as much as I'm a Braves fan, I think there's a part of me that sort of enjoyed getting out of that when I'm seeing that sort of environment, because it allowed me to sort of take in the whole stadium without being so invested in the game, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So yeah, I actually, now that I think about it, I don't think I've ever seen the Braves play on the road. I may be forgetting, but I don't think I have. I think that I've only ever seen them at home.
The reason I've asked is, I'm a Braves fan, and I'm an Ohioan born and raised, which should make me a Reds fan, but I'm one of those kids that grew up with TBS in the house, and they were on like every night, right? I listened to Skip Carey and Pete Van Wieren and Ernie Johnson every night on TV, and but I've seen them often on the road, and I'm like you. I'll go if we're going into a city just to visit it, we'll go to a baseball game, whether the Braves are there or not. I just love seeing other stadiums, and I like to get there really early for batting practice and then take my time looking into the nooks and crannies of the ballpark. But the Braves tend to have pretty decent fan support everywhere they go, in my experience.
Right.
And that's a TBS thing, surely.
Yeah. And I think, the Cubs are the same way, I think, because of WGN. And then the Yankees are that way just because the Yankees. But yeah, I've definitely, you can notice that even a lot of times. You don't notice it as much as when you're in person, I'm sure, but you can notice that even just watching the games. But like whenever the Cubs come into town, it's probably 40%. And if the Braves are doing well, it's 40% Cubs fans. The Braves are not doing well. I've seen it even be like, this seems half and half to me.
Yeah.
And I think some of that's, Chicago just being a bigger city.
Yep. And, there for a while, it took a special sort of willingness to endure abuse to be a Cubs fan, because they were hapless for so many years before they finally got their title recently.
Right. Yeah.
Do you have a favorite ballpark?
And I feel like that always in certain teams, like that makes a more loyal fan base. And I don't even necessarily think that's a good thing, but, not to bring it back to college football, but University of South Carolina lost every game for 2 straight years one time. Like we tore down the goalpost when we beat New Mexico State.
Yikes.
So but we would still have 75, 80,000 people at every game in the middle of losing, 21 consecutive games. And I think to a certain extent, the Cubs were that way. They're not as much. And I think the success kind of obviously it's a pro, but it does, I think, take away, now they don't show up if they start losing. Whereas it used to be, what's his name? JC Bradbury. He's a he's an economic professor who writes about baseball. So he does a lot of sabermetric stuff. He did this thing one time, and this was, I believe, before the Cubs won the World Series. And he showed that fan attendance was more highly correlated to beer prices at Wrigley Park than it was wins and losses.
That's hilarious.
So it's you can lose 90 games, but if you raise price of beer from $1.50 to $2, we are protesting.
Midwesterners like beer. I mean, some stereotypes are true. Do you have a favorite ballpark?
I really liked AT&T Park in San Francisco, and then most of them have their own pros and cons. I tend to not like the really generic newer ones. I don't love the new Braves Park. I mean, there are parts about it I like, but it just seems they could have done more with it as far as having character. But maybe that'll come over time. But then again, Turner Field didn't have the most character either. So, and I think a lot of the character from the Brave Stadium before then, old Fulton County Stadium, was just you could visually picture Hank Aaron, breaking the record there. So it had nothing really to do with the stadium.
Or Otis Nixon making that catch.
Yeah, just those moments. So, a lot of times I think, the moments can end up making the character later. Camden Yards in Baltimore I always have really liked. It was sort of the original of this current style.
Yep.
That they're doing now, but I think people sort of copied the basic idea of the style, but haven't executed as well there. I haven't been to Petco Park, but I always thought it looks really cool on TV, but I'd have to go there to be, to see it. The times I've gone to San Diego, there weren't games there. So
me too. I walked around.
If I had to pick
Park,
one, I would probably say AT&T in San Francisco if I had to pick one.
I haven't made it there yet. It's on my list.
Just the bay being right there is just such a cool aspect. Like depending on where you're standing, so you look to the right and there's the bay. The left, they're playing baseball, and it's like so much closer than you really get it. Like on TV, that they can hit it into the water, but you don't it really is just past the fence is the water.
I'm hoping to get there someday. The ones on my list is that one, like the ones I haven't been to. That one in Petco, and I haven't been to Baltimore. And you might think I'm crazy for this, but I really want to see the Kauffman in Kansas City. I know they've done some remodeling there. And it looks pretty on TV.
And is that the same? Have they changed stadiums since Bo Jackson's times?
No, they just
that's what I was thinking. So,
they just made it look prettier.
I would go there and I would immediately see Bo Jackson running up the wall.
Yep.
We have nothing against that.
If you can swing it, I recommend Pittsburgh because that's my personal favorite. There's a river out beyond right field, and you got to hit it a lot farther to get it into that river than at San Francisco, but it's doable. And the view of the city from anywhere in the ballpark is just spectacular. And then the year before the pandemic, that's 2019, I got to Coors Field for the first time. And the first thing I noticed was it's really big. And I know everyone says it on TV, right? But in person, you're like, oh, this is what they mean by there's so much more outfield space, because there's just a ton of outfield space. It's really weird.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's like they've finally gotten it to the point where there's not really even more home runs there, but it's still easier to hit in because even though you hit about the same amount of home runs, it's like the outfield's just gigantic. So the batting averages are still through the roof there.
Yeah. Unless you got 3 Andrew Joneses in your outfield, there's going to be a lot of doubles and triples hit at that ballpark.
Right.
So tell the folks what you have behind you there and what kind of room you're in.
Oh, well, so that's a moving blanket because
it wasn't mean. I meant the pretty things. With the 6 strings.
Yeah, I wasn't sure what all you could see in the view. So I play guitar and just a little blues rock type band. These are the 3 guitars I just happen to have down. One's a little resonator guitar. The red one here is the one that's actually really nice and kind of expensive. That one I put together from a bunch of different parts. The Strat, so the kind of gold one. But I really liked how it came out. But I've kind of over the years, it's kind of the ship of I keep wanting to say Theseus, but I don't think that's right. You know what I'm talking about? Yeah. So, because I had a body that was some of these parts wrong. Then I bought new pickups, put that on that. Then I changed the neck out. Then I changed the body out. So this guitar, I think maybe literally I think this screw right here is the only original part of this guitar.
That's hilarious. And Franklin, to describe it, Frank was pointing out the neck, the headstock where the tuning pegs are.
So, I play guitar. So, and I'm here in my little rehearsal space / recording studio. It's kind of slowly turning actually into more of a recording studio. I've had some other bands besides my band in to record recently. So that was really interesting and fun.
How long you been playing guitar?
Well, it really depends on how you count. I've had a guitar since I was probably 13, but I didn't actually I'd maybe play a couple of chords. And then let's see, 5-6 years ago, I started getting pretty serious about like, hey, I actually want to learn how to do this. So that was when I would say I started playing guitar versus like the way that before that, it was like every kind of guy my age knows how to play two chords on a guitar. So that's kind of where I was before then. And then maybe 5 years ago, I kind of got where like I really would, practice every night type thing.
What made you make that choice? Like what motivated you to say to yourself, I want to be better at this instrument and really play it well?
It just was something I just wanted to start doing. Like it was like, so I can tend to be like at times pretty over analytical about things, but then sometimes I'm pretty good at just being like, hey, I sort of feel like I want to do this and going with that. So that was that really. Just seemed like something I wanted to be able to do, to get up on a stage and play with some people and, us all have fun. And that's kind of, I think we've mentioned this before. That's kind of, I think, where me and you differ a little bit. My like motivation is pretty much always like, I like songwriting stuff, but I kind of always think of it in the context of I want to be in a band.
Yep.
Versus I think yours is always from, our conversations has always been like, I want to write songs and release music.
Yep. I'd also love to be in a band, but that's harder to do.
Yeah. Well, and that's kind of, we both want both, right? Like I also want to write and release music, but it's kind of like, for me, that's a consequence of being in a band.
Got you.
So,
yeah. So for me, it's like, I don't have a band, but I'm not going to let that stop me from releasing music, if that makes sense.
Right.
So,
yeah. And I haven't decided, like, I think about this sometimes, like, if my band, like, totally fell apart, would I keep, like, I know I would keep playing, but I don't think I would write songs and make songs, and record songs. I mean, I might, who knows, but I just think I would, like, probably put jam tracks on YouTube and play.
That's interesting. I kind of want to talk about that because one of the things I like to have other musicians on this podcast and especially other songwriters, because none of us, even though we might use the same tools, none of us approach songwriting the same way.
Mm-hmm.
And for the most part, songwriters I've spoken to, we at least all do it for very similar reasons, but I feel like you don't. And I'd kind of like to examine that because I find it fascinating. So here you are gathering up these guitar skills. You've decided that you want to be a decent guitarist, or better than decent. Like you want to actually learn how to master the instrument. When did you decide to actually write songs? Was it after you had a band?
Yeah, I'd have like these little snippets and pieces of stuff, like, oh, that's kind of cool, but I never like really had any motivation to sit down and like actually turn this into a song. Getting that motivation to take these little pieces and make them into songs is really, I think, the hump for almost everybody. Like, I think almost anybody who's played any amount of music, you'll have these little snippets of things you did, like, came up with. And really, it's like whether you put in the effort and like, craftsmanship in a way to make those into songs. And what got me that point was having a band and being like, well, I knew I didn't just, and nothing to disparage people who are in cover bands, but I knew what I wanted was to be in a band that did at least some original. So it was like, well, nobody else in this group of people I have has written anything. So I guess I need to take some of these little snippets and turn them into songs. That's kind of the motivation to get me to do the work aspect of songwriting. I think as far as like my inspirations and what's behind each song is probably similar, as in, wanting to express myself and feelings that don't quite fit exactly into just words you can say to people. I think that's still there and true. But like I said, what gets me over the hump to like say, all right, I've got this riff and this one little melody, but now I have to write a bridge and I got to figure out the rhythm. I got to figure out how to tie these two parts together. Like that stuff's all kind of hard. And most songwriters don't love doing it. So like, it's like, where is your motivation to get over those? And that's where so yeah, that's where I think it's a little different than some songwriters is like, well, I got to write for a band. I think I was listening to an interview with Rich Robinson from the Black Crowes, and he was kind of similar. He's like, I write songs now, even though, I'm a solo project. He was like, but I never would have started writing songs if I wasn't in a band with my brother, and we needed songs to play.
Necessity, the mother of invention.
In this case, I think it's almost like necessity, the mother of work, because the invention part, like that sort of lightning rod of inspiration, that's not the necessity part. Like the things in my songs that are like, yeah, that's kind of cool. Those usually just sort of came, from playing, the pure joy of playing and the pure joy of wanting to express yourself. The part that's not like sort of the inventive part, the sort of drudgery of songwriting, that's really where the necessity comes in.
So are you motivated to, and for one of a less nerdy expression, hone your craft as applies specifically to the craft and the art of songwriting? Like, in other words, or do you want to study the songwriting craft such that annoying stuff gets easier for you eventually?
Yeah, well, yeah, and by, I guess, hard, it's really more like sometimes you don't think it's as interesting to figure out how to come up with a bridge just because the song needs a bridge that works, so, and yeah, I mean, I study songwriting all the time, but I studied songwriting before I ever even thought about writing songs. And that's just the music lover part of me, and also just, I think, my general personality, even going back to what we were talking about with baseball, if I'm into something, I don't want to just sort of passively take it in. I want to understand how it works. So, I studied songwriting. I wouldn't have called it that, but I did, long before I ever started really playing or especially writing. I'd be talking to, there's this guy from my hometown who's like, he's a fantastic piano player and he leads like this sort of yearly charity benefit, but he's like super into the Beatles. And we would just sit there and like talk about the nerdiest things about Beatles songwriting. Like, and I would even use musical terms and stuff, going here and yeah, they modulated up a perfect fourth or whatever. And we, say stuff, So yeah, I was studying all that, I think, as long as I can remember, period. Like, as long as I have memories, I can recall studying songwriting. Now, where things changed maybe a little bit would be like, reading books that are super mechanical about some stuff and chord substitutions and stuff like that. But I'm kind of almost able to separate that as like, I like reading about that just from an intellectual standpoint. And then it also helps me as well. So yeah, to me though, like the challenging aspects of songwriting aren't the parts that are hard to motivate myself to do. Like, I can write a bridge and it can be fine. Like what makes something truly great aren't those trudgery parts. That's where, getting a great melody, right? And you, I'm sure, know this as well as anybody. I think we've even talked about this. Like that is kind of the magic thing, yep. Right? I mean, yeah, you can sit there on a keyboard and hammer out notes that are in the chords and scale and hope you run into something great, but your best melodies almost always just come to you. And that's the hard part. Like, in a way it's hard, but it's also not hard because I think you can work on it in just writing lots of songs, but you can't be like, all right, I want to make better melodies. The only way to do it is just to do it a lot. One, you will get better at sort of hearing things, I think. And two, you'll just have more options to choose from if you like sit there every day and try to come up with some sort of melody. And a lot of times I think it's just as simple as like everything that comes to you recording in some way or another. So yeah, that was kind of a long and rambling, went in a lot of different directions answers, but that's kind of my thoughts on advancing as a songwriter. Lyrically, I think especially in the band I'm in now, I have to try to write less clever lyrics, I think, at times. Because my tendency will be to just sit down and come up with like, all right, I want to have this amount of alliteration, rhymes here and here, partial rhymes here and here to match up with this and that. And then I want to use like these kind of double meaning word and then a lot of times I'm like, we're a rock band. I need to make this much more like just a straight, simple anthem type thing. So if anything, I think lyrically, I have to force myself to dial it back a little bit at times. Although in some songs it can work to just get the more stuff. And then I think eventually I probably will do some stuff that sort of falls into solo project land, just as, well, that's what's sort of left over that didn't fit with my band.
I was just going to ask if you were going to scratch that clever lyrical itch by eventually doing something in a slightly different genre.
Yeah, I mean, the good thing about rock is depending on how you dress it up, almost everything can work. It might be like not the quote unquote single, but so a lot can work there. I think once I start getting enough songs written that we're not using almost all of them, then that'll be kind of a thing to look at. And then it'll also, I think there'll come a point where I want to decide if I'm writing songs for other people, because part of it too, a lot of times is, the genre I write in, a lot of it is, well, that's kind of how I sing and that's kind of how I play. I was watching a John Mayer interview once and he was like, sometimes I get, X, Y, and Z about my songwriting is like, but my voice is the way it is. And that sort of guides a lot of the songs, and you can take voice to be both literal and metaphorical there. My voice can literally sound this way when I sing, and that sort of shapes you. And then also just my sort of viewpoint, so to speak, can kind of guide where things go. So, and writing for someone else is such a different, I think, thing when it comes to that.
Tell me about some of your influences.
They're kind of all, it depends on what aspect of thing.
Let's go with your guitar playing style first.
Yeah, guitar playing, Dickie Betts from the Allman Brothers is probably the biggest one. It's just kind of how I hear things coming out. A lot of times are really just like hearing Dickie Betts play. And then, of course, it comes out a little differently when I play it. But Mick Taylor from the Rolling Stones, I think those are my biggest influences in how I play. Now, that's not necessarily, I mean, they are among my favorite guitarists, but I have a lot of guitarists I absolutely love, but I don't play anything remotely like them, partly out of just physical differences. And then, partly just that's not kind of the path I took, but I still like to hear that when I'm listening to music. So yeah, those I would say those two, and then there are a ton of like little ones here and there. And then songwriting wise, Rolling Stones are a big one. And then it's hard to almost even separate the Black Crowes from the Rolling Stones as far as songwriting goes, because they do things so structurally similarly. And I'm just talking kind of music wise at that point. Lyric wise, I couldn't really say, and I'm sure I have them and I just don't recognize I have lyric writing influences, but I can't, like when I'm writing lyrics, it's just sort of what comes to me, versus like if I'm playing, I can kind of be like, yeah, that's definitely like influenced by this riff on Can't You Hear Me Knocking, or whatever. Versus like songwriting, it's just like this lyric sort of came to me and it worked at the time. And then as far as like putting it all together, I think Tom Petty's like such a and especially it's Tom Petty and Mike Campbell together, just so good at putting all the elements together into a song that works. I think he's probably like my favorite song craftsman. You know, the arrangements are always so spot on and are interesting, but still like leave the focus where it needs to be. Still have space, but, you know, have a lot of interlocking parts. So, you know, kind of always come back to that. And then, you know, the Beatles, I think, you know, that Lennon-McCartney dynamic, I think is always a really interesting one to look at. I try to consciously sometimes put in Radiohead stuff.
My man.
And elements. It's tricky to get it to work right, though. Like, you know, it's one thing to say, like, yeah, let's have this sort of like almost Tom Petty song with the Allman Brothers like solo, but then throw in some great, like, you know, it's trickier to get it to work than it is. But from time to time, there's little pieces that does. That single I just put out, there's kind of this like dreamy background guitar part. It's kind of almost like a sort of Radiohead type thing, you know, to have a sort of pad that the song sits in, but it also gets so out of the way at times you can, you know, it definitely doesn't feel like a Radiohead song. But so that's kind of how I put it all together.
Would you like to play the single for the listeners?
Come on, girl, hold the bed. I can't be sure it don't matter when. We've been down too many times. Tonight we're gonna feel what the night finds. Love will keep coming, don't bother running. Never feel this again. Love will keep coming, find something from it. One more kiss is a sin. Love will keep coming, don't bother running. Way over our head again. Love will keep coming, take something from it. So the guys can never mend. Keep up, girl.
Thank you again to Franklin for joining me. His departure was just a little bit unexpected, but fear not, dear listener. At some point, I will have him back. We will talk more about probably music and baseball. Thank you, dear listener, for listening. Would you be so kind to leave a review or like or subscribe on the podcast listening location of your choice? I'd appreciate that very much.